And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's Torah study. Today is Thursday. It is July 8th, and we're learning the laws of kosher. We're learning today kosher etiquette. It's how you're supposed to conduct yourself at home, or maybe wherever you're eating, in order to be able to maintain the laws of kosher. So what's most important is that you need to be able to separate the dishes and to separate the foods. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, about how to conduct proper separations in order to implement proper protocols to be able to ensure the maintenance of kosher. One thing to buy kosher food. It's another thing to maintain the kosher food, because if the non-kosher flavors spreads throughout the house and spreads throughout the table, then the kosher fish or the kosher meat non-kosher. So that's what we're learning today in our kosher crash course, which we already have sequenced actually on our YouTube page. If you want to see all of our kosher crash course, you can actually go to our YouTube page. It's at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. And if you click on the playlist, which is called Kosher, I know that Winston in Indonesia already put it together. So it's already there. It's somewhere there. I just don't know exactly where it is, but it's on the page at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. So we're gonna put it in a very prominent place at the beginning of the email to be able to beginning of the website, youtube.com/Jewish Gardens, to be able to find it easily, to be able to go through all the kosher laws so that you can go through them whenever you're ready, review them, and have all the laws of kosher to be able to know how to go kosher. So here we are. We are learning the laws of kosher. Today's Torah study is dedicated by Ed Hochman in loving memory of his mother, Frida Hochman, whose yard set is this week. May her soul be elevated in Gan Eden. Also by Daniel Geiker, who dedicated this entire month of Torah study in loving gratitude to Hashem for the good health of Michael ben Miriam. They continue to have good news always. So let's talk about the kosher etiquette relating to bread. It is proper to have a knife that is designated only for bread and nothing else. Not to use that knife to slice anything which is either dairy or milk, in order that you shouldn't make a mistake. Because here's the problem. If you're going to use a butter knife to cut your bread, then the bread now becomes milchik. Certainly the slice that you just cut, the edge of that slice becomes milchik. So even though the slice that you're eating with a butter knife, you probably know to eat it milchik, but the rest of the bread, which you put away in the bread basket for tomorrow or for whatever, for later or for someone else, they won't know that the last slice of the bread was with a butter knife or a meat knife, in which case it became meat or dairy. So you're simply setting yourself up for a problem. You cut the bread with a butter knife, there's a little residue of butter oil on the bread now, and the next person uses it for a pastrami sandwich, thinking that bread is parrot, not realizing that it was cut with a knife. There was either dairy or meat. So too, a person should be careful not to touch the bread with hands that are dirty with either milk or meat. Again, for exactly the same concern. We have the same issue with a knife designated for, I'd like to welcome Marty Knopp from New York, and Winston from Indonesia. Winston actually just posted our link for all the kosher videos that the kosher crash course videos that Winston has kindly sequenced for us with the assistance of Howard and Susan from Boynton. So thank you very much for that, Winston. We just need to make sure, I need to discuss with you how to make that into a prominent, if there's a possibility, Winston, for you to put that on the homepage, that it becomes an easy kosher playlist to see it. You see it on the homepage, it'd be easier to do that. Thank you. Joe G, good morning from Joe and Rue. And to Rob Berger from Chicago, it's a pleasure to study with you. Okay, good. So let's keep on going. So we spoke about it. And also Winston, I see on YouTube, Andy from Louisville, and Elaine from Ibis. Wonderful. Okay. So in the same way that you're supposed to have a designated knife for meat, like a designated driver, right? Sorry, a designated knife for bread. Like a designated driver, you're also supposed to have a designated knife for vegetables for exactly the same reason. You should have a parav knife, which is used only for fruits and vegetables. Why? So that in case you might come to cut a sharp vegetable like a garlic or a jalapeno, or a onion. And what does that do? We spoke about this last week, how the sharpness of the flavor being cut resuscitates the retired flavor inside of the knife. So let's say the knife was used a week ago for meat. Now it becomes fleshik all over again, and that makes the onion a fleshik onion. Right? Fleshik meaning meat or dairy. And that's why you got to be careful that your fruits and vegetables have a designated knife, which is parv. It's never used with a meat or dairy knife. And that way you never have to worry that there's a transfer of flavor because of a sharp food. I mean, even think about it, something like a radish. I mean, is a radish a sharp food? I guess it is a sharp food. But radishes do the transfer of flavor like any sharp food. And therefore, you got to be mindful of the fact that in order to institute proper etiquette, you need to be able to have a knife that is designated for the fruits and the vegetables. What about a salt shaker? You should have a meat salt shaker and a dairy salt shaker. Whether you're using them open and you're dipping the food inside, or if you're using them closed where you pour the salt shaker over the food. Because what happens then is that the salt shaker might touch the food. Let's say you got meatballs. You pour in the salt shaker, you drop it or something, and now the cover of the salt shaker, that metal cover, just touched boiling hot meatballs. So it's boiling hot. It became fleshik because the heat transferred the flavor. So the top of that milk shaker, the top of that salt shaker, is now fleshik, right? And that becomes a problem using it forward. Also, another issue is that the steam that comes out of the food upon which you in the airspace above the food where you pour the salt also goes into the salt and it practically cooks them. So because it's strong heat, you put the salt shaker very close to the hot food, even if it doesn't actually touch the food, because it touches because it goes into the steam, then it's considered like it was cooked, and the meat goes into the actual salt. So the salt becomes meat, and now you have a problem. We're going to use that salt shaker for milk. Now, when you are using other spices for meat and milk foods, or if you're using one salt dish, one salt source for both meat and dairy foods, you got to be careful not to bring the spices or the salt too close to the food itself, in order that it shouldn't either spray from the food onto the salt or the spice, and also that the steam shouldn't go up into the spice or the salt. Rather, you should use a designated spoon, right? A designated spoon, which is parv, for this purpose, and to make sure not to put the spoon into the actual food. Right? Same reason. Let's see a question coming in from Marty Knopf. Can bread knife be used for non-sharp veggie? So can you use the bread knife, which is only for bread, for a non-sharp veggie? Now, technically, the answer is yes. Absolutely yes. But kosher etiquette would make it best practice to just keep a designated knife for all vegetables. Because then people aren't necessarily thinking about how sharp this particular vegetable is. If you're cutting up a salad, you got your cucumbers, your tomatoes, and your avocados, and your onion. And they're not really thinking about which vegetables to separate the sharp from the non-sharp vegetables. So that's why best practice, Marty, would be to just designate one for all veggies. Okay, good. Let's keep on going now. Let's talk about tablecloths. It is appropriate that a kosher home should have two separate tablecloths. One which is used for dairy foods and one which is used for meat foods. And you should not eat upon the table itself or on the same tablecloth, because you're worried that there'll be leftover food on the tablecloth or on the table, and that will include also residue oil, right? So now what happens is you just had your meatballs, a little gravy spilled over the table, just became fleshik. And then later on, your children are eating cereal. I don't know what, something falls out, a little piece of cheese sticks or something falls out of the plate, and it touches, and the pasta, marinara sauce, whatever, it just touched the meat. It's complicated. It's all a big mess. So if you have two separate tablecloths, you're good to go. So if you have if you have like a plastic tablecloth, something which is, which doesn't, where the stain doesn't go through. So it's not a fabric tablecloth, but it's a plastic one where you can just wipe it down and it doesn't go through from one side to the other. Then you can actually flip it over. You could just flip it over for meat and for milk. Use one side for meat and the other side for milk because because the residue of the food doesn't go through, right? As long as you're using it for cold foods. But if you're using it for hot foods, then you can't turn it over from one side to the other because the flavor can become enveloped into the actual tablecloth itself, like it goes into a spoon, a fork, a knife, or a pot itself. What about towels? How about towels? Dish towels, right? It's appropriate to have designated towels for meat and for milk because sometimes you use them to schlep the hot food off the stove, right? And with that, they could draw into themselves some meat or some dairy, which is hot, right? So too, you also need to have cleansing utensils. The sponges and the whatever, the little brushes that you use, the steel wool that you use to clean the dishes, right? Including the dish in which the soap actually sits, the little sponge, and the shmatis to dry them. It's good to keep best practice, keep things nice and separate. People come to my house and they see that we built our kitchen with a wall in between. We built literally a wall. We have a mechitza in our kitchen. It's like two separate kitchens, the meat and the milk. It's separate. We have two of everything. Easiest way. Keep it nice and simple, all right? Now, what about salads? You had a salad for breakfast. It was a parve salad. It was a parve salad. Let's say you cut the onion with a vegetable parve knife, right? And now it's a parve salad. You ate it with breakfast, with dairy, and now you have leftover of the salad. You want to use it for lunch with your meatballs and pasta. It would be appropriate to avoid that. To avoid eating parve foods that you ate with dairy together now with meat, and vice versa. Best to avoid that. However, according to the strict letter of the law, if you did serve such a salad or other parve foods with designated parve utensils for them, in other words, there was never a transfer. You never used like a meat spoon for the dish, you never used like a meat spoon for the salad and then later using a dairy spoon because now you just messed the whole thing up. The meat spoon has got residue of the meat. The dairy's got the residue of the dairy. Now it's all mixed up inside the salad. Now this applies, by the way, for example, to a mayonnaise. You get like a mayonnaise, a jar of mayonnaise. You don't have dairy mayonnaise and meat mayonnaise, right? So you have a mayonnaise, right? So what do? You use it if you're using it for your meat meal, right? You want to make sure you're never taking it out with a meat. If you stick a meat spoon in there, then the whole thing becomes meat. You want to make sure you're using a parve spoon to take out the mayonnaise, because otherwise, if that spoon goes inside, then that whole mayonnaise becomes meat or dairy, right? You got to be careful. So, in other words, if you did use a parve food like a mayonnaise or a salad for the various for alternating meals in such a way that you were careful to use the parve spoon, then it's actually not a problem. But best practice is to be mindful and conscious of this issue. Good morning, Cookie. Nice to see you with us. Boker Tov. Okay, good. All right, we're going strong here. Let's keep on moving. Any questions? Please let me know. What about a sharp food, which is parve? A sharp food that's parve. For example, I don't know. You have like a garlic aioli. What?
Onions.
Onions. You have onions or a garlic aioli, right? Like a dip. So if you have a spicy food, which you want to keep it parve, so that you can use it later for meat or for milk, you got to be careful to store it inside of a parve dish, because remember, when something is spicy, the flavor transfers flavor transfers either from heat instantaneously, or from sitting liquid in 24 hours. But if it's spicy, it's 18 minutes. It transfers the flavor. So you got to make sure that your spicy food that you want to use for meat and dairy is going to be stored in a parve dish. Parve means neither meat nor dairy. It means neutral. That's parve, right? So you want to make sure that it sits in a parve dish, because if it sits there for 18 minutes, it's going to draw out the flavor from the dish. If you store your onions in a meat dish, even if it's clean, the onions will revive the flavor inside of the dish again, and the onions will then become meat, right? Okay. Now, what happens if a person ate meat and has not waited 6 hours? You've not waited 6 hours. So you know how it works. We spoke about this before earlier in this course. That after meat you wait 6 hours. After dairy you wait 1 hour. So if you meet and you haven't waited your full 6 hours yet, you are allowed to eat dairy foods. Sorry, you are allowed to cook. I'm sorry. Did I say eat? You're allowed to cook dairy foods. And we're not worried that you might go to taste the foods that you're eating. So you're allowed to cook dairy foods, even though you still have to wait until 6 p.m. Until you're allowed to eat them. Because we're not worried that you're going to sort of taste from the ladle or something, to be able to taste the food that you're eating. However, if the nature of the food that you're cooking is such that it is the nature of this food to taste it, then you should be careful not to cook them when you are dairy. This law would apply, for example. It looks like Mickey's with us on YouTube, and it looks like Cookie's with us on Facebook, or the other way around. Whatever. Okay, doesn't matter. Anyway, it's good to have you guys. On a fast day. It's a fast day. We got a fast day coming up on Sunday. Not this Sunday. I think it's next Sunday. Tisha B'Av. So what happens on a fast day? You're not allowed to eat on a fast day. I think the fast comes out like 9 p.m. here or something, right? So you want to prepare something delicious to eat. So you start cooking 6, 7, 8 o'clock, right? You're not allowed to eat. Are we worried that you might come to taste the food? Technically, yes. But you are allowed to cook food even though you're not allowed to eat it. Unless it's such a food where you really need to be tasting it along. That would be a problem that you need to be mindful of. Okay, now let's talk about washing your hands between touching meat and touching milk. A waiter who's working to prepare foods that are meat and in order to serve them, and he now wants to eat something dairy. So he's serving for meat, but he wants to eat something dairy. He's got to be careful to wash his hands before he touches the dairy foods, because the nature is for residue of the food to get stuck in his hands from the oil and other residue of the food. And therefore, a person should be very careful in his house when he cooks dairy to wash his hands before he touches anything meat. So wash your hands between the meat and the milk. Right? This is high hygiene standards that we Jews have thousands of years before anybody ever discovered nanotechnology and the microscope to teach us about viruses, right? So let's talk about hot water chayniks. A hot water chaynik is an urn, a hot water urn, to pour water from a hot water urn into a meat dish, right? So you got a parav urn. The urn is parav, a hot water urn, and you want to open the spigot to pour water, boiling water into a meat dish. So you got to be careful when you pour hot water from an urn, which is higher, into a meat pot which has meat in it, not to make it too close. Because what's going to happen is that the steam is going to rise from the meat. As it hits the meat is now boiling hot, right? Boiling hot means flavor transfers. If it's too close.
Use something that's parav.
If you use something that parav, if you're using something that parav, that's the best way. Take something out of the parav. But even then, the parav, which is pouring out the boiling water, right? You still need to make sure that parav dish doesn't get too close to the meat, because the minute the boiling water hits the meat becomes cooking stages, right? And now, if it's too close, then the steam is going to cook the meat into the parav urn or the parav pouring dish, right? Because the moment it hits 43 degrees Celsius, if the steam is at 43 degrees Celsius, right, then they basically transform. They transfer the flavor from the meat into the urn to making the urn fleshik, right? And then you won't be able to use that urn for dairy anymore. Okay, now let's talk about stovetops. Stovetops. So you're allowed to have one stovetop for meat and for milk, or do you have to have separate stovetops, right? Ideally, it would be best for every house, every Jewish kosher home, to have two separate stovetops, one for meat and one for milk. Why? Because the food which is being cooked will splash. You're making a pasta, you're making a sugo. We call it sugo in Italian. It's like the marinara sauce you put in the pasta. It splashes all over the place, right? You got to keep it covered, right? There's certain foods that splash, right? Or you're cooking up oil and it starts spraying all over the place, right? So what do? if you're cooking on like let's say a dairy omelet or something in oil or something deep fried, then it's going to splash the oil, which is now dairy, all over the place, which is going to bring it in onto the other parts of the stove, and that basically causes the rest of the stove to become treif, because it's got dairy and meat flying all over at the various meals that you cook. So it's got cooked into it, the meat and the milk. It turns out that you might come to a problem when you cook a food or let's say so let's say the stove itself, the area in between the stovetop, right? The stove itself is not such a problem, because the stove itself gets boiling hot and it koshers itself every single time you turn it on. Once it hits the high heat, it's already koshering itself. It purges any flavor that's in there. But the place in between the stove is now has got sprayed on it meat, it's got sprayed on it dairy, right? Because you're using the same stove. And now what happens if a meatball falls into the spots in between the stove? Or some dairy, something liquid falls in between the stove, the actual burners. It's a treif burner. The surface of the stove is treif, which is okay, as long as you're conscious of the fact that the surface of the stove is treif. Right? The burners themselves, you can have a one stove for meat and milk. It's okay, as long as you know that the surface of the stove is 100% treif, and any food that touches that is going to be treif. Right? So ideally, you should have separate stoves if you can. If you can, that's the best way to go. But if you don't, just bear in mind that the surface of the stove is treif, and anything that touches that is treif. So too, you want to be careful to remove from the stovetop anything which serves the meat or the dairy foods, like a shelf or anything else that's able to touch the steam, right? Anything which is too close to the steam, right, becomes a problem, because the steam of the food will make that thing treif, and then let's say the meat, like let's say you have those what do they call those things on top, like a little vacuum on top?
Pressure cooker.
No, not a pressure cooker. Like let's say you have, I don't know, you have like a little shelf behind the stove, right? So that shelf is too close to the cooking food. So it gets the flavor, it gets the steam, the hot steam of meat, then it gets the hot steam of dairy. So it becomes treif. And then the next time you cook something, it's got the hot steam of treif coming back and forth. So that becomes a problem. So try to remove anything which is too close to the stovetop. And that would be the kosher etiquette for a stovetop. Right, best things to have two separate ones, but if you have to have the same one, an exhaust fan, that's what I was talking about. If you have to have the same one, then you got to be mindful of these things. Now, the exhaust fan, though, Marty, is further removed. It's not like right there above the stove. It's further removed, and the whole purpose of the exhaust fan is to cool it down. So I don't think the exhaust fan would be such a problem, because it's further away. It's not really going to be that close to the heat source.
It's also usually pulling the air.
Yeah, it's pulling the air. It's pulling in. There's always like a wind in there, so it's kind of cooling it down. Let's talk about a microwave and ovens for meat and milk. You're not allowed to use one microwave for meat and for milk. Similarly, you're not allowed to use one oven for meat and for milk. Why? Because the steam of the food obviously is cooking inside of the oven, inside of the microwave. It gets absorbed into the walls of the microwave and in the walls of the oven, and then it becomes a fleshik oven, a fleshik microwave. And the next time you cook in there, it's a fleshik oven cooking dairy food, and the whole thing becomes treif. Therefore, the best way to go, best practice is that every kosher home should have a separate oven for meat and a separate oven for milk. Or even one oven, which has two compartments. You have the top, a double oven, right? With some sort of a mechitza in between it, right? Obviously. But if there is no separation between the two ovens, you cannot use it for meat and for milk, because the walls are absorbed with the initial flavor, and then they're absorbed with the secondary flavor, and the whole thing becomes treif. When we were building our kitchen, our kitchen designer was a little confused. He said, "Remind me, Rabbi, why you needed 4 ovens again?" So we needed obviously 2. It was a double oven for meat, because we have a lot of guests. Dairy was 1 oven, and the 4th oven was parav. We had a parav oven for challah, for example. When my wife bakes challah, she makes it in the parav oven. Right? What?
Question.
Yeah.
Which leads me to ask another question that may be a topic on its own, but I can see where a person, if they own their own home, and by home I mean like a townhouse or a full home, could probably convert their kitchen as you would put it in terms of having a
If you own your house, you can modify your kitchen. But if you don't own your house, then what's the problem?
That's one thing. The other thing is, what do you do if you're living in a condo?
Basically, if you're not in the master of the house, what can you do about the kitchen? That's the question. Joe G's asking the same question. She says, what about those who can have 2 or 4 ovens? So here's what I recommend. If you only have 1 oven, then you buy a toaster oven. Like a smaller countertop oven.
It's really a miniature oven.
It's a miniature oven. It's just it's a countertop.
Yeah.
You buy it, instead of building it into your kitchen, you have the regular oven. It's going to be your meat. You decide if you're a vegetarian or something, it's going to be easier. But if you don't eat, let's say you're lactose intolerant, then you just make it meat or something, right? But if you want to eat meat and dairy, you use the main oven for either meat or milk, you decide. And the other oven, the countertop, right? You use that as your medium milk. Until one day you're able to modify the kitchen and take ownership over it, right?
Well, in a condo situation, you do own that apartment.
So then you can modify the kitchen.
You can modify the kitchen.
Of course you can modify the kitchen.
But
You need a
don't have-
contractor?
but you don't have that kind of room in a condo.
You can work it out. Don't worry about it. You can work it out. There are places you can get a double oven. You can put it in. It's not that doesn't take that much space. Whatever. If you don't have the space, you can get a countertop oven. Finished. Or maybe get a bigger place. Okay. What about teeth? What about teeth with fillings or false teeth? What do you do about that? What about that? So a person who has the possibility to buy 2 sets of teeth, fantastic. One for meat and one for milk, that's great. However, the majority of the codifiers have ruled that today they make the false teeth out of a certain kind of very hard material. It's like an enamel. I don't know what it's made out of. In such a way that you don't actually need to use 2 separate teeth for meat and for milk. And therefore, you don't have to kosher them before eating. Interesting question, right? Similarly, somebody who has crowns or fillings in his teeth is allowed to eat meat and milk, and he doesn't have to worry about koshering them. And the same thing would apply for braces, I guess. You have braces. Anything you put in your mouth, you can't take it off. Exactly. Okay, let's take a look at the comments coming in. Mickey, if there's a rule of less than 1 in 60 treif to kosher is still kosher, then why, if you use 1 oven with a little use of steam or dairy or meat, such a prohibition? The reason is like this, Mickey, because the rule of 1 in kosher being canceled out is only ex post facto. But you're not allowed to use that rule a priori. Only if you already did it, then you can rely on the 1 in 60. But you cannot say, I'm going to do something 1 in 60, and therefore it's less than 1 in 60, and it's going to be fine. That's the prohibition. Second of all, how on earth can you possibly really be able to calculate that? Right? How are you going to know? What are you cooking in your oven that's less than 60 times? That's less than 1 in 60 of your oven. I mean, seriously, like it's going to be something so minuscule. It's like a piece of corn or something. Like, what are you really going to do with that? So that's not going to work. Terry says that doesn't work if you want to have guests. Well, look, I mean, there's different kinds of ovens. I guess you're talking about the countertop oven, I think, Terry, you're talking about. If you want to have guests, you're right. Then maybe you have guests for the meat meal, not for the dairy meal, right? Maybe you have to work it out like that. So you figure that the guests that you're inviting will be with the guests in the big oven, not the small oven, right? Depends on how many guests you're doing. So you got to be able to modify. Check with your Rebbitzin to find out how to do it. What's the best way? What's a good recipe or a certain kind of food that will fit to make it work.
Just don't put the guests in the oven.
Yeah, don't put the guests in the oven. Joe G, so your meat oven can be your parv oven. No, your meat oven can't be your parv oven. Oh, you mean a third oven? You mean in terms of a third oven? No, well, what you do is now, if you only have 2 ovens, you got to be careful. You got to be careful that whatever you cook in there is either meat or dairy, and you're not cooking parv. It's an interesting question you're asking there. Parv is a fascinating sector of Jewish law. But for now, for the purposes of now, let's suffice it to say that you're keeping that you don't have parv cooked foods. Let's keep it at that for right now, okay? But I will be developing that idea later on in further classes. Last thing I want to mention to you today, second last thing is what about coffee creamer, which is actually non-dairy? It's parv. A non-dairy coffee creamer.
Non-dairy, but they're not parv.
Oh, I heard there was a terrible story in Israel recently. A woman who was allergic to lactose. She was in a meat restaurant, and she had a severe allergy to milk, so she ordered coffee with creamer at the end. And they brought her coffee with creamer. It was supposed to be in parv. It was a kosher restaurant, and she died. Turns out that the creamer wasn't non-dairy; it was dairy. In a meat restaurant. It's a disaster story in Israel. The woman died. A terrible story. So you got to be careful. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know what the story was over there with the labeling. I don't know. Was it labeled or not labeled? I don't know the details. But in any event, if you do have a non-dairy creamer or some sort of a non-dairy, what do you call it? Katsefet. It's like a whipped cream, right? But it's non-dairy, right? Don't know why you want that. It doesn't taste so good. But if you wanted that, right, then obviously you'd want that in some sort of a meat function, right? And you want to serve coffee and cream, so you do that with a non-dairy creamer. But now there's a problem of marit ayin, which is perception. Marit ayin means it looks like you're serving treif. So what do you have to do? If you have foods that are easily recognizable as being parv, as being neutral, you are allowed to eat them in a meal, which is meat, even together with the meat, because you're not worried that people are gonna think that you're serving treif, right? So therefore, if it's very common, for example, to have non-dairy ice creams, right, or soy. What do they call them? Soy, tofu, or not non-meat meats, like tofu meat, whatever that thing's called, right? Soy, exactly. So you don't have to worry about having a false perception. But if you can easily give some sort of an indication that it is part of, it's better to do that. How do you do that? You leave like the packaging on the table, which says non-dairy cream, or you put a sign. When we've held events where we do these kind of things, we'll put a sign on the table that says non-dairy creamer, because people get confused. They're like, oh, I went to the rabbi's event and there was meat and there was milk, and they didn't really think about it. But if you put a sign that says non-dairy creamer, then nobody can make that mistake. Finally, when it comes to the perception relating to soy milk, right? So now you got milk. And you got milk. It looks like you're serving milk at a meat event, right? So what do? Soy items that are not so easily recognizable as being parv. For example, milk. People don't think of milk being a soy milk. You see milk, you think it's milk. You think it's cow milk, right? Right? Or almond milk. You don't assume that it's almond milk, right? Therefore, what you have to do over there in such a case, if you're serving milk, parv milk after a meat event, then what you have to do is leave the packaging or a sign out there which says that this is non-dairy. And if you don't have the actual packaging, then at least put out a sign.
Just so you know, in Israel,
yeah,
the absolute majority of flesh restaurants do not carry anything parv for coffee.
So Steve is telling me that for this problem, that the majority of kosher restaurants in Israel that are meat will not serve anything that even looks like dairy because of a false perception. But the thing is, they could if they wanted to. There's no problem if they labeled it properly. Like on the menu, you said non-dairy creamer. Like, what's the problem? Everybody knows that it's a non-dairy creamer. When a person eats and drinks foods in a meat meal, these foods in a meat meal after eating meat, we have no concern about Marisayan false perception. He can eat and drink them without any problem, even if he left nothing left over as to indicate a sign, a proof that this is non-dairy. So it's not a problem, but you have to be conscious of the fact that this is a potential problem, and you got to be mindful of that. So that concludes today's Torah study, which is the Kosher Crash Course. Tomorrow morning we'll continue only on Zoom, where we study the law. A video for bringing with the Rebbe. I'm not sure. I don't remember what the topic is tomorrow. So join us tomorrow morning at 8:30. Winston is asking a question. After drinking milk, do you need to rinse your mouth? Or after eating milk candy, do you need to brush your teeth before the waiting time starts? The answer is yes. You are supposed to rinse your mouth, or even better, to brush your teeth after eating dairy. The way we learned it was that according to the most lenient opinion, if you just wash your hands and mouth and rub and cleanse your hands, then you are allowed to eat meat right away. We, the Chabad custom, wait 1 hour after dairy, but at the very lenient opinion, you are after dairy allowed to just wash your hands and wash your mouth out and eat meat. After meat, however, you do have to wait 6 hours. And with that, folks, I'm going to call it a day. So thank you very much for joining me here this morning. Shalom, and we'll see you tomorrow, God willing. Thank you.